This is the middle one.
I'm joined here today by our esteemed speakers, Hans Ingels, the head of unit for bioeconomy. Sorry. I'm joined here by our esteemed speakers today, Hans Ingels, the head of unit for bioeconomy, chemicals, and cosmetics at DG GROW, the European Commission, Teresa Schell, the head of policy for chemicals and GeoChemSec, Christos Vasilakos, the head of office to MEP Dimitris Theodras, and Stephen van der Broek, the executive director of product stewardship at CEFIC. Welcome, everyone. Today in Europe, the chemicals industry is at a crucial moment in its battle to remain competitive amid rising energy costs, tightening environmental regulations, and mounting pressure to innovate and decarbonize. We've witnessed the closure of dozens of production sites across Europe in the past few years, and even more competition coming in from the US and China. Europe is not leading the chemicals race anymore. It's becoming a marketplace for others to compete for dominance, as I mentioned, the US and China. The global market share has declined by over 50% since 2003. But chemicals do contribute to 96% of all manufactured goods across Europe, which is precisely what we mean when we say it is the industry of all industries. It's the building block for everything, from the chairs we're sitting in to the glasses we drink our water from, and from the building that the summit takes place. So it is a crucial moment to speak about what is happening right now with the chemicals industry and when it comes to regulation in Brussels. The first question, I'd like to get right into it and ask the question that's on everyone's minds. Hans, I'd like to ask you, where are we in terms of the timeline for the REACH revision? And what are the main reasons behind this delay, especially since the Commission had promised for the proposal to be finalized by the end of this year?
Thank you for this good question. As you know, it's not a secret that we submitted an impact assessment to the Regulatory Scrutiny Board on the revision of REACH. And there, the Regulatory Scrutiny Board told us in more than 10 pages that we had to resubmit the impact assessment. And there were quite some difficult questions and difficult remarks that the Regulatory Scrutiny Board made. So colleagues are now trying to address all the different comments from the Regulatory Scrutiny Board. They're not always easy because the data are not always available. And so colleagues are working on this. And so the impact assessment, as soon as ready, will be resubmitted to the Regulatory Scrutiny Board. If you get a positive opinion, and we assume that we'll get a positive opinion, then the REACH revision should normally, if all goes well, be published during the first quarter of next year.
First quarter of next year.
Yeah, that's if all goes well. Of course, depending on the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, because we have to. If you get an opinion of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, it's not a yes and no. So probably the second opinion will also give us a number of elements that we have to incorporate in the final version of the impact assessment. So it's not that immediately after the second opinion of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, you can go ahead. So it will take a few weeks to finalize it in the light of the second remarks of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board.
I'd like to move on to the rest of the panel as we're all eagerly awaiting to see what happens with the REACH revision. What do you expect to see from the revision when we talk about building a competitive and sustainable sector? Teresa, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this panel. I am very curious to what will be there in the end. But I mean, the Commission has been working on this for many years now. I mean, 5 years ago, they started or were already in the middle of working on this with preparatory papers and studies and so forth. And it was very clear that what we really need for REACH to do is to increase the protection of human health and the environment, but also to speed up the phase-out of the absolute worst chemicals. And it was then suggested to do this with a generic risk approach to phase out the worst chemicals, the most harmful substances from products. And also to create clean material streams to make sure we can have a circular economy. So that's on the table. That's what we were promised. I don't think that's going to be what we see in the proposal from what we have already heard from the Commission and what we are also hearing in the corridors. And at this point, I think it's super important to safeguard the main principles of REACH. And you may think that this is a given, but today it's really not. It is about keeping the phase-out aim in REACH, because today I'm not sure that that will be kept there. So to keep that in mind, to have it as an overall aim to phase out the worst chemicals, that is very important. We have the no data, no market. We have the phase-out aim. But we also need a toolbox to do this. This toolbox needs to be available so that we can use the best tool for each chemical and each use. And this is something I'm afraid of, but I really fight very hard to keep. And it is being done right now in the world of simplification. And I think we can all agree that it's great if we can simplify REACH. It is rather complex. But simplification doesn't mean making it simpler to use the most toxic chemicals, because that is deregulation. So I really hope we will not end up in deregulation, because this doesn't create the competitiveness that we need for European industry to thrive. So let's safeguard the toolbox and phase out the worst possible chemicals, and make sure that it has a substitution driving mechanism, because that's how we create push for innovation within Europe.
Thank you, Teresa. Now I want to hear from the industry, from Stephen. For you, what does it mean, what does the industry need from REACH in terms of cutting red tape and providing more predictability? And what does a REACH revision look like that is both predictable for the industry, but also protective for citizens and the environment of Europe?
Yeah. Thanks, Jacob. Yeah, I also need to use this microphone. I always feel a bit like a singer. And I'm very tempted to start singing, but I won't do that. Now, before I dive into REACH, there's maybe one thing I appreciate you opened the panel debate with a bit painting the picture of the current economic situation of the industry. But I would like even to go one step further. I think we're really in a phase where we're more in an existential question about where's the future of the industry going. Yeah. I mean, we recently, on Friday, we launched our economic report again. We do it every quarter. All economic indicators are deep red. And the big challenge we see is we don't see any improvement looming at the horizon. So I think for the industry, we feel we're at a turning point. We see more and more also investor communities getting out with messages like it's the industry, it's a kind of break or make moment, which is very worrisome. And I think, and we will come back on it also later on with the Critical Chemicals Alliance, but it's important to keep this one in mind, that what we are facing today, it's just not the dip that we have seen after the economic crisis in 2008 or even after COVID, where we always had a steep recovery within, let's say, 4 to 6 months. We don't see any improvement. We already had very low indicators for a long time. So just to keep a bit this picture in mind, and I just want to make sure that we all have a common understanding on that one. Now, when it comes to REACH, what I always find intriguing, and I was some time ago, and Christos was also there, was in a panel debate with him in the parliament. It was also about REACH. And then at a certain point in time, there was an intervention made. And someone said, look, but in 2007, REACH was put on the table. It was back then a legislation way ahead of its time. I think today, when you look at REACH, the design of REACH is still pretty unique compared to many other legislations. Quite a comment was also made at the end when we talk about simplification, because yes, we need to keep the level of protection, but we want to simplify. Is the simplification now really coming from the legal rules, or is the simplification, or is a burden coming from, let's say, the way the REACH legislation has been implemented over the past 15 years? I think that's an important distinction. And where we are today more as an industry is saying, like, you can simplify REACH, you can improve things, you can go back to the spirit of the original REACH, like, for example, on the registration dossiers, but you don't need to open the legal text. You don't need to go overturn everything on the legal text to make the thing simpler. So I think, and then one element of that, I just make the reference to the data requirements. What we have seen is when REACH, the spirit in REACH was, let's generate data on chemicals, allowing us to make a good judgment on whether chemicals are safe to be used. I think that was the spirit of REACH. It should be still the spirit of REACH, but over 15 years we have seen REACH has turned into a data generation vehicle. And it's always more data, more data, more data, trying to fix the latest digit after the comma. So for example, on the data requirements, you can see how can we bring back the original spirit. So I think that's where the simplification can come from. It's also better alignment if we launch restriction ideas, or if we identify a problem, better alignment, better predictability, how we're going to tackle it. What is the best regulatory tool? So this mechanism and these things, this thinking has already been put in place. So let's see how we can really build upon what's already out there and how can we make that one stronger.
Well, one thing when we define simplification, of course, we can also refer to in regards to the, for example, the generic risk approach as part of REACH, a blanket ban on harmful chemicals. Do you see this at all as being attached into the REACH revision or as part of regards to reopening the legal text, or is there another way to go about this?
But on the generic risk approach, what I find interesting, what I hear today, the generic risk approach is now often framed as the simplification idea. Because the procedure is too cumbersome, it takes too much time. And it feels like the generic risk approach is the solution, the only solution that ever exists to simplify procedures. I'm not sure. Yeah? When I listen to people in discussion that was some time ago in Caracal, I will not go into details or not repeat what we have said afterwards, but when I listen to that, I always say, I hear like, this is the only solution. And then people say, we need to add this and we need to add that. So for me, it's like no one thinks of, but what can we improve of the current registration procedure? Are there things we can gain there? Are there things we can improve there to make things faster? And not only think about a generic approach as the solution to speed up procedures.
And Christos, I want to go to you because of representing the political institutions in the European Parliament. I want to ask, what is the current atmosphere awaiting the REACH revision in the Parliament at the moment, especially from your office?
Yes. I would like to start before we go to the core of the question that we have to see in the Draghi report a very good finding that Europe, as of 2019, has adopted around 13,000 legislative pieces, far away, more far than around 5,000 legislative pieces by USA. So it says something. It says that we have to simplify our regulation and not to continue the over-regulation. In this regards, our aim has to be to ensure that our business and industry spend less time and energy on paperwork and more time on innovation, growth, and planning. After that, Omnibus is coming. And I think that you'll share with me that the chemicals policy is at a turning point this time. So we have to do something. We have to react. And simplification, our office consider that it's one of the tools. And of course, we welcome the 6 packages that the Commission has proposed so far about the simplification in different strategic areas. And the last one is the simplification on the chemicals. I think that the proposal of Omnibus 6 from the Commission gives a real signal that the EU can deliver targeted simplification without lowering standards. Because simplification is not about lowering ambition. Simplification is not the regulation. I fully disagree to this. Simplification, it's about creating a predictable, science-based, proportionate, and resilient regulatory framework to sustain Europe's chemical industry. We have seen so far how smart could be the simplification within OSOA, where I had the privilege to be a key part of the discussions. Because within OSOA, we managed to make a major step towards to modernize the EU chemical policy. Now, we know that the proposal by the Commission has a lot of benefits. From our side, we'll try to keep these benefits for the industry, for the innovators, and for the competitiveness. And our focus will be to find a balanced, science-based outcome that will strengthen the trust to the citizens, will provide legal certainty to industry, to competitiveness, and support Europe's chemical and cosmetics industry as they transition towards safer and more sustainable solutions. Yes?
Sorry, I want to rewind a bit before we dive even further into the chemicals omnibus. I want to bring us back to 2020. That was the year when the Commission came out with its chemical strategy for sustainability. And one of the targets of this strategy was the protection of human health and the environment when it came to the REACH revision. Hans, I want to ask you, how has the geopolitical context, as Stephen has also mentioned, changed in the last 5 years? That the chemicals industry is now even further mounting pressure, and how can this how is this changed in reflection of the REACH revision in itself, especially given the commitments to phase out harmful chemicals?
No. Geopolitically, we all know that 2022 was a fundamental change. It was a fundamental change for many industries, a fundamental change for the EU, a fundamental change for all our international trading partners. Because suddenly the circumstances fundamentally altered for businesses specifically, and for the chemical industry especially, because the chemical industry was very much dependent on oil and gas, and then we cut off our gas supplies from Russia, which means that this cheaper gas went to China. There was also a lot of capacity building in China. There was also slower growth in Europe, which means that there's less demand. So overall, since 2022, and since the war in Ukraine, things have fundamentally changed for the competitiveness of the EU chemical industry. And you see it in all the statistics, you see it in the production capacity, you see it in the number of closures. This is a very bad period for the chemical industry. Does it have an impact on the attitude in general towards the chemical industry in general? Of course, because it's important that we keep the chemical industry here in Europe. It's important that we, for reasons of strategic autonomy, that we have a good competitive chemical industry in Europe. We may not become dependent for many chemicals on suppliers from outside Europe, because if not, we'll find ourselves in the same situation where we become overly dependent. And the chemical industry is known as the mother of all industries. So in other words, if the downstream industries don't get any chemicals, for instance, because somewhere outside the EU, somebody decides to punish the EU and to stop supplying chemicals to the EU, we might be in deep trouble. Has it an impact on the entire discussion on sustainability? Not really, because after all, we're all human beings. So protection of human health will always be a priority. Protection of the environment will always be a priority. So the general context has changed. In other words, it's important to keep a competitive chemical industry in Europe. And that will be the priority also here for the Commission during the next few years, given the difficult international context.
And of course, also one of the targets of the chemical strategy of sustainability was the REACH revision. And since for 5 years now, it's gone through several delays. The European Ombudsman also found the Commission in 2023 responsible for maladministration for not releasing the full IA. And of course, the Ombudsman also found that the Commission is taking 5 times the legal limit to provide authorizations on banned or harmful chemicals. And since then, we have a system also where ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, must approve a registration for a chemical within 3 weeks by law, but a restriction in itself for a harmful chemical can take close to 20 years. That's a decade to understand the hazard, and another decade to regulate and control it. My question is, how do we reconcile that with protecting our citizens, maintaining the trust in the classification, the transparency from the Commission, and also ensuring competitiveness? We have this debate regarding the REACH revision when it comes to a market-first principle, or is it a citizens-first principle? Because we're discussing whether or not there's no data, no market. Teresa, I wanted to start this question with you.
Oh, this is a very tricky question. I mean, for me, there is no opposite between regulating chemicals in a good way and competitiveness by companies. And I agree that chemical industry is important, but we are not to forget all the other industries that we are also seeing in Europe, and they are the brands, for instance, that are using the chemicals. They are part of the backbone of the European economy. And we have a lot of interactions with them. I don't know if people know what we do, but we are an NGO that collaborates with a lot of companies, both downstream users and alternatives providers and investors for that matter. And what we see from these actors, everyone, and that includes the chemical industry, of course, is that predictability is the most important thing. And these companies that we collaborate with, they are benefiting from having an ambitious chemicals management system in place, and they want chemicals regulation to be ambitious because they are pushing the market, but they want others to follow. We should also remember that this market is not static. It's not like the prices remain the same if we increase the push for substitution, for instance. So it's a very dynamic situation, and I think the most important thing to keep the pressure and actually keep innovation in the EU, but also provide the possibilities for companies to work on this, is to keep that predictability, say, we are the grown-ups in the room, we stay the course, and I really appreciate hearing from you, Stephen, about the appreciation from the chemical industry of what we actually have today. It's a great piece of legislation. REACH, as it is intended, is really a good piece of legislation. The implementation, that can be discussed and certainly can be improved. We can also make improvements of what is already there in implementing acts and so forth. So, I mean, there are many ways to improve REACH. I don't know if this answers your question, but yeah.
I want to direct this back to Hans, because I wonder now, if there is not really a need to reopen REACH, how do you respond to this argument?
For me, it's clear that there's need for simplification of administrative processes for REACH. Now, how you do this is also a political decision. So as far as we're concerned, because this is why we make an impact assessment, this is why we precisely spend our time on doing this, to inform politicians to make the right choices. And this is the difficulty that we're having, is to assess all this and to see where the potential could possibly be.
I also wanted to ask you about, and this is go back to Stephen as well after your answer, the Critical Chemicals Alliance. This is a way to unite stakeholders across the European chemicals industry and figure out solutions together. Could you elaborate a bit on what this involves?
Yeah. So the Critical Chemicals Alliance will involve all the EU chemical industries, plus also other associations which are interested in chemicals, plus businesses, plus trade associations, so plus member states. And the purpose is indeed to keep the chemical industry competitive in Europe. So essentially, the Critical Chemicals Alliance, we should issue recommendations, and they should do it fairly soon, on a number of topics. The first one is critical chemicals, critical sites, because there is entire discussion which chemicals are important for European downstream industries, which are not, which sites are critical and which are not. Another one on trade, because we hear a number of complaints that there's at the moment an unfair trade situation whereby too many cheap chemicals are being imported in the EU, whereby the EU industry cannot compete. But we should also have a discussion on innovation. So a working group will focus specifically on innovation and substitution. And then finally, it's also a question of lead markets. Where is the potential for lead markets, for instance, for the feedstocks? The Critical Chemicals Alliance will hold its first General Assembly on the 13th of January. That will be in the Netherlands, on the Camelot site. And the purpose is to start working immediately, so that based on the input of these 4 working groups, the Commission has operational recommendations, ideally after the summer break of next year.
And Stephen, do you see the Chemicals Alliance as a solution?
If I may, before I respond to that question, maybe also come back on your previous intervention on the restriction authorization process, because I found that one a very interesting example. And my response to that would be, and I come back to what I said before, is it because there's a problem with the legal text, or is it a problem how people have been using it? And I always use the example. I mean, what I've seen and witnessed is that often REACH is considered as a kind of Swiss knife. And people that heard me speaking before, they say, "Oh, there he goes again." But it's seen as a Swiss knife, and you have many tools in there, and they think, "Oh, REACH can solve everything." But in a Swiss knife, you also have a saw, and then you see people starting to try to cut trees with the saw of a Swiss knife instead of using the chainsaw. That might be called workers' protection legislation. And also, that's if you look at what has created the whole issue with the authorization on chromium, you can really wonder what's going through authorization. Was that the best thing to tackle the problem, or were there more effective tools? So think maybe better upfront what is the best way to tackle the problem. You can prevent also a lot of delays. And I come back to the fact, so that's not the way that the rules need to be changed. It's more how you deal with the rules and how you put them in practice. Maybe also one comment on the innovation. I mean, I always find it intriguing to hear that people say, "Yeah, but we need to have a strong legal framework phasing out everything because otherwise nothing will move." I think where we look at it also much more is, but how do we create incentives for the innovation? Because at the end, let's be realistic, and I hear this, and I'm not contesting the companies that they are ambitious and they are sustainable, but at the end, are people willing to pay a higher price? Are consumers willing to pay a higher price? Are companies willing to pay a higher price for alternative substances, for alternative technologies? Often they don't, because everyone is trying to keep the bookkeeping in order. So again, how do we overcome this? I think that's more to gain than just put another set of restrictive rules into place. On the Critical Chemicals Alliance, we are fully behind this initiative. We think it's very important that it's set up. CEFIC is behind. We will participate. We think there can be actions coming from that can stop all the site closures we're facing today. So yes, fully behind. But I would say let's also make sure that actions are coming out of it, and that it doesn't come a group of talking, and in 5 years' time we might have finally see some action. Because, like I said, if I look back on where we are today, 5 years' time, we might even consider, but why are we doing this? Oh, they're all gone. I'm overdoing it, but I think that's a big risk in that. But we're fully behind this initiative, and we really want to make this work, and that leads to concrete action.
Thank you, Stephen. I want to turn now away from the proposals that quite haven't landed yet, like REACH, and move towards the Chemicals Omnibus. The Chemicals Omnibus is now currently inching closer and closer to the trilogues. The Council recently adopted its position, and now it's moving through the Parliament, where, Christos, your office is leading the file. I was wondering if you could give us an update on the Parliament's timeline for the Chemicals Omnibus.
I cannot say a fixed update, but I can say that we are in fruitful discussions between the two rapporteurs, between the two committees, and we are trying to find a common ground to start the discussions. We are trying to find which will be the modalities during the negotiations. For example, the ENVI committee has the competence of CLP and the cosmetics, and the IMCO committee for the fertilizers. I believe that very soon we'll find a modality, and we'll start the negotiations, we'll start the discussions within the Parliament, with the political groups, and will establish a concrete timeline that will allow us to deliver a very good and stable omnibus proposal, hopefully by end of April.
End of February, we'll mark that on our calendars. And if you're looking at the position in regard to the Commission's proposal and the Council's position recently, and now looking at towards the Parliament, Hans, Let me bring you in here. From the Commission side, how are you preparing for the omnibus trilogues? Because this is the first real test of simplification in the chemicals industry.
First of all, we count very much on the European Parliament to table its amendments, because at the moment we only know what the Council position is, but the Parliament still needs to work on it. And we would really urge the Parliament to do this, because ideally we would like to conclude this file before the summer break. It's important also to pass this message to all the industries concerned, that the simplification will actually take place. I know that simplification omnibuses are a bit challenging, because we cover different topics, so necessarily it can also cover the competence of different committees in the Parliament. We're aware of this. We had the same problem in the Council, because it covers CLP, cosmetics, and fertilizing products. But we really would appreciate if the Parliament would keep this simplification in mind. Simplification means simplification of administrative processes. Simplification means that, for instance, on CLP, that we've got clear and practical rules on labeling, that also we've got clear rules that can be applied by businesses on internet sales. For cosmetics, that we give a reasonable transition period, that we also give the opportunities to SMEs to file exemption requests, because now, at the moment, it's only multinationals essentially have all the information for a possible exemption request for cosmetics, and transition time is very, very short. And also that we try to reduce a bit of the REACH Plus requirements under the fertilizing products regulation, which is voluntary. And two years ago, we had an affordability crisis for fertilizing products. So therefore, we also have an interest in ensuring that a bit of the paperwork is being reduced. And here we really ask the Parliament, could you then ensure that these trilogues could start in April preferably, and that somehow we can then build a consensus in June, because after June there will have to be approved by Council, voted in Parliament and so on. So in the most optimistic scenario, we've got then it published in the official journal in November.
Let's see.
And Christos, there's a lot of political energy around the file, clearly at the moment. I mean, how do you see the internal dynamics in the Parliament right now as the report takes shape, especially seeing the difference between the Council position and the Commission proposal regarding the use of cancer-causing chemicals, or CMRs, and also the labeling of chemicals, the digital by default rule?
Yes. I will start from an initial position that, in general, the Commission's proposal is a good one. And we believe, our office, that is in the right direction and in the principles of the simplification that I mentioned before. Now, the current situation is that we have a Council position. It's a fact, and we cannot ignore it. So we have to think how we will find a common ground, possibly between and I mean for cosmetics, between the Commission's proposal and the Council proposal. Regarding CLP, I consider that the proposals by the Commission are very good, and that's the difficulties that the industry face right now, and we had identified these difficulties since the previous discussion on CLP. But as you can understand, as you know, in the Parliament, we have to find a compromise. And sometimes for the compromise, you sacrifice some things. So the fonts was one of these things. Anyway, now we have a good proposal by the Commission. I believe that the industry and most stakeholders are more or less in favor of the Commission's proposal regarding CLP. We may need to fix some things, but we'll do it. But for the cosmetics, there we will have a discussion. And there we have to find a balanced solution that will enhance the trust of the citizens, because we have to take into account that for us, the protection of the health and environment is non-negotiable. And for our office and for the rapporteur and for me, it's non-negotiable. It's the first principle. But from the other side, we have to think the problems, the pressure, the multi-pressure that the industry faces right now. High energy crisis, regulatory complexity, intensified global competition, and the urgent to decarbonize. All of these push industry great pressure. So we have to think about it. And our focus will be to find a compromise of proposal, a balanced proposal, to be science-based proposal that will protect the resilience of the industry, that will protect the safety of the health and the environment, and at the same time will keep Europe to be competitive in the globe. Otherwise, if we don't, I believe that the cost of non-action is much higher than the cost of making smarter rules and simplified rules. So I consider, as we did in CLP and in OSUA, that with the other political parties, we have built a very good collaboration. We'll try to find a common ground, a consensus, and to conclude the report from the Parliament's side timely, as soon as possible, and hopefully, as I mentioned before, by April, so as to have the room within the Cypriot presidency to negotiate it with the Council, and if possible, I think that with the Commission will be in a good collaboration to conclude the file timely.
Thank you, Christos. Of course, I would love to discuss the chemicals omnibus even further, but we only have less than 10 minutes left, and I want to move towards another important topic that's coming up next year, and that's the PFAS restriction, the EU-wide PFAS restriction proposal, which is currently in the hands of ECHA right now in Helsinki. Teresa, I wanted to move over to you because ChemSec has been at the center of this effort on forever chemicals. But as we know from August, ECHA chose not to cover the 8 new sectors that was added to the proposal's revision. This is the first time in history, actually, a chemical restriction proposal was split by ECHA, and it could set a dangerous precedent. How do you see the industry and policymakers navigating these carve-outs as the process moves forward?
Thank you for the question. I think that what I said before about the importance of predictability really is the guiding star of everything, and for PFAS, it's the most important thing. I think when the member states put the dossier on the table, it sparked an innovation that I have never seen before. We found alternatives providers everywhere, willing to scale up, to find new solutions and so forth. What we see now, with the Commission not being so clear about how comprehensive the proposal will actually be, ECHA carving in one way, and we'll see what happens with the Commission in the next. This has really started to affect companies now. And we see this. I heard from a company last week that they were and this is from the electronics industry, but we see it across the line, that they are now, since about 6 months back, starting to see that alternatives providers are less interested to invest in their solutions, less interested to work together to find new solutions. So this unclarity is really damaging this process. The mere anticipation of regulation is enough to drive innovation. And this is why it's super important to keep this dossier together, because PFAS is a problem because of all of its wide uses. It's used in everything. And we cannot just choose little parts to phase out, but we actually have to do it all to be able to address the problem. I mean, if you have a leak in your house, you don't turn down the water tap a little bit. No, you turn it off. That's what we need to do now. So I would say my strong encouragement to the Commission is to take this seriously. We see the push from companies, but also from investors that really want to see a full phase out of PFAS because of its liability problems. So keep the comprehensive dossier together and be clear about it so we can keep this predictability.
Stephen, I also want to go over to you because when we consider essential use for the industry, what does that mean when it comes to PFAS? And how will we define that in the coming months?
Well, first, if I can make an additional reflection on the PFAS restriction. The fact that it takes so long, and I come back to what I said before, maybe if you would have thought it better of, because you now went, let's go for everything in one go, maybe if you upfront would say that maybe we can tackle problem X via this, problem Y via another route, problem. So I think that could have speeded up things, and also still give the necessary clarity. So that's one. I don't see that ECHA has carved out anything. I mean, it's not up to ECHA to carve out things. I think at the same time, ECHA also is under pressure to deliver an opinion. This file is so big, at a certain point in time, you say we need to move on, because we can keep on debating in Helsinki for another 15 years also, which is also in no one's interest. So just a few reflections. On the essential use, whether you call it essential use, critical applications, essential use is a very loaded concept. We have a lot of debates about that one. I remember 4 years ago, you could not be in a meeting on chemicals policy without having endless discussion on essential use. What I see is today there are certain applications, whether then it's in the semiconductor industry, it's in batteries and all these kind of things, where there are no, let's say, ready-to-go alternatives available. And then you need to make the consideration, do we want to continue that way? Do we still want to have batteries and deployed and we be ambitious? Or do we just cut everything and wait until the alternatives are available? So that's also a way of looking at it. I think when it comes to particular chemicals plant today, these chemicals are the only one that can keep a lot of operations safe. And then make sure that we have safe operations. So again, do you just then cut everything and demolish plants and then wait until something happens? These are a few other considerations, just saying, oh, it's essential for society, because it's a never-ending debate.
Thank you, Stephen. I would like to talk so much more about chemicals, because it's going to be a huge fight in the coming months and next year when it comes to PFAS, REACH, and the chemicals omnibus. So do stay tuned in the coming months and 2026. That's all we have for now, but I'd like to give a round of applause to our amazing panelists for such an enlightening discussion. And up next, we have an interview between my esteemed colleague, Gabriel Gavin, and with the Danish Climate Minister, Lars Aagaard. So stay tuned for that as well.